Group C Sportscar Racing was a golden age for speed. The concept of speed had never before been pushed so far during wheel-to-wheel combat. Starting in 1982, it wasn't immediately clear the magnitude of the madness about to be unleashed, but within a decade, the fight for sports car glory had birthed the fastest racing machines ever built. This is the story of Group C Sportscar Racing. Created to compete in the new Group C class at Le Mans and in the World Sports Car Championship, the Porsche team went all in on development of the 1982 956. The engine was carried over from the previous generation Porsche 936 Group 6 car. The 2.65-litre flat-six turbocharged engine, originally developed for IndyCar, hence the unusual displacement, produced 635 brake horsepower, which may sound low compared to the top-flight race cars of today. However, thanks to an aluminium monocoque chassis, the 956 weighed just 800 kilograms, about the same as today's Formula 1 cars. The biggest difference, however, between the 956 and its predecessors was the aerodynamic characteristics of the car. It was designed to take advantage of the ground effect, which in practical terms meant the 956 generated approximately 3 times more downforce than the Porsche 917 that had won Le Mans only a decade previously. The hard work paid off, as despite missing the second round at the Nürburgring in 1982, the Porsche 956 would take championship victory, the first for the Group C class. A victory made even sweeter by an absolutely dominant performance at Le Mans, in which Porsche 956s finished first, second and third, setting the bar extremely high for any would-be competitor. The following year, lightning struck yet again for the Porsche team, as they claimed yet another championship victory and yet another Le Mans win with the 956, a car which by now had come to define Group C sportscar racing. Despite their obvious and commanding technological lead over their competitors, Porsche weren't keen to become complacent and risk letting slip what was shaping up to potentially be an era of dominance. To this end, they developed the 956B for 1984, an updated form of the 956 boasting improvements such as an increased engine displacement, now 2.8 litres, as well as suspension and aerodynamic changes to eke out as much performance as physically possible. To help ensure victory at as many circuits as possible, though Porsche were not the only manufacturer to do this, Porsche created 2 different rear wings and front winglet sets, to give teams the option to either run a high downforce setup for circuits like Spa, or a low downforce setup for circuits like Sarthe. The low downforce setup meant that the cars were able to hit 225 miles per hour down the Mulsanne Straight. This was of course the era before the chicanes. The changes made were clearly beneficial, as 1984 saw Porsche win the World Endurance Championship for the 3rd time, though the Le Mans victory fell to Jost Racing and their 956B, who beat the Rothmans Porsche team that had won previously. The Rothmans team still came out on top overall in the championship. Porsche were dominating the WEC, but the plan had originally been to also run in the IMSA GTP Championship. Unfortunately, the 956 didn't meet the regulations and was banned on safety grounds, due to the driver's feet being in front of the front axle centerline. By 1985, Porsche was bored with simply dominating the WEC, and desires to race in IMSA were reignited. Step 1, of course, was to modify the 956 to make it eligible to compete. So they extended the chassis a touch, moved the pedal box behind the front axle, and upped the displacement to 3 litres. It turns out the IMSA regulators were maybe onto something with the 956's safety, as 1985 saw the tragic death of Stefan Beloff at Spa after a collision with a new 962 being driven by Jaguar X. The 962 wasn't just built for IMSA GTP, it also became the replacement for the 956 from 1985, with many teams choosing to upgrade to the more powerful and safer car, with more still following suit after the death of Beloff. That being said, Jost Racing won Le Mans again with their trusty 956B, while the WEC went the way of the Rothmans team yet again, who started the season with a 956 before switching to the 962C to take them home. 1985 also saw the new 962 compete in IMSA, where, perhaps unsurprisingly, it won the championship in its debut season. The 962C proved a worthy successor to the formidable 956, with the Rothmans team winning Le Mans and Brunn Motorsport running a 962C winning the WSC, making it the 5th year in a row that a Porsche had done so. To even further cement into the minds of literally everybody that Porsche was the best at building race cars, the 962 won the IMSA GTP series again too. Porsche's total domination of the two largest sports car racing series in the world cannot be overstated. They seemed to be unbeatable. Right up until they weren't. 1987 saw trouble for Porsche. It had been privateer teams winning with the 962 as of late, with Porsche scaling back its Group C and IMSA GTP development programs, and it started to show. Despite the Rothmans Porsche team scooping up yet another Le Mans win in 1987, the WSC belonged to someone else for the first time in over 5 years.
Swiping Porsche's long-held World Sports Car Championship crown in 1987, then ending their Le Mans winning streak too in 1988, Jaguar put an end to Porsche's dominance, and it was no fluke. Designed by Tony Southgate and built by Tom Walkinshaw Racing, Jaguar's early XJR series Group C cars were built for one purpose: to beat Porsche, which I'm sure they appreciated. Southgate's aim was to design a car that would exploit Porsche's weaknesses that not many people believed they had. He would come up with design concepts that would confound the engineers at Porsche and propel Jaguar to championship victory in 1987 and 88 for both the Constructors' and Drivers' Championships, as well as taking victory at the illustrious 24 Hours of Le Mans. So how did they do it? Southgate started working on Jaguar's Group C project right from the start, being brought in to design the XJR-6 for Jaguar's 1985 entry. He was given a massive V12 to work with. At the time, he said it was the largest engine he'd ever seen. Although the engine did show some promise, its sheer weight and shape would be a major challenge for the design team. But that was the job given to them. Southgate would have control over every other aspect of the vehicle, but whatever he designed, it had to be powered by that V12. Standing in Jaguar's way was Porsche. Their cars were incredibly reliable and, believe it or not, really fast. They had been at the top of the class since its inception. They were sleek and aerodynamically impressive for the time, but Southgate realised their obsession with long tails was far more of a weakness than anyone at Porsche knew. He sought to take advantage of this. Southgate had done some previous wind tunnel testing at the Imperial College London Wind Tunnel and Rolling Road while working on the Ford C100 Mark III. Porsche, meanwhile, had done their aerodynamic testing in a wind tunnel with a static road. This was enough information for Southgate to believe he had better data than Porsche, and on the off chance that Porsche had not accounted for this difference in aerodynamic testing, there might be an advantage there. The 1985 XJR-6 boasted a 6.2-litre naturally aspirated V12, a vastly different approach to Porsche's turbocharged flat 6. Unsurprisingly perhaps for a debut season, the XJR-6 didn't perform very well in 1985, managing 7th in the championship overall, though it is worth saying that of the 6 teams that beat Jaguar, 5 of them were racing Porsche 956 or 962s. The XJR-6 clearly needed some revisions to really take the fight to Porsche, and work began on a successor. That successor wouldn't arrive in time for the 1986 season, however, and so the XJR-6 would fight another day. They increased the engine displacement by 100 cc's and sent it out racing once again. It fared slightly better this time, coming joint third in the championship and managing a race win at Silverstone, but the team's sights were set much higher. For 1987, the XJR-6's successor was finally introduced. The XJR-8 was powered by a monstrous 7-litre V12. Much of the rest of the car was pretty similar to its predecessor. but the newly enlarged engine gave the car 720 horsepower and a top speed of over 220 miles per hour. To improve downforce and do so with as little additional drag as possible, the advancement they made was that a large enough and correctly shaped rear wing could act effectively as an extension of the bodywork, creating an area of sufficiently low pressure as to pull air out through the venturi tunnels in the floor of the car, greatly increasing the effectiveness of the ground effect most Group C cars were designed to take advantage of. Additionally, Porsche's boxer motor layout interfered with their ground effect tunnels, limiting the effectiveness of their floor's aerodynamics and leaving room for a competitor, maybe like Jaguar, to do it better. The XJR-8's ability to pull air out through the venturi tunnels with its large wing meant that the tunnels could have a much steeper angle as they reached the rear of the car. This would increase effectiveness of the ground effect even further, and it was something that Porsche couldn't do even if they wanted to, because their boxer motor and transmission layout was already interfering with their shallower tunnels. Another area that Jaguar sought to improve over Porsche was the chassis. The 956 and 962 were based on relatively basic aluminium box frames, which were far from cutting edge. Southgate instead worked with Tom Walkinshaw Racing to create a carbon fibre monocoque chassis for the XJR series Group C cars, creating an incredibly stiff structure while also saving weight. The XJR-8's humongous 7-litre V12 was placed as far forward as possible, right up to the shoulder of the driver. Because of the weight of the engine and its relatively high centre of gravity, it dominated the vehicle's design and handling characteristics, easily offsetting the weight saving made by using a carbon fibre monocoque. But the placement of the engine, along with the car's aerodynamic design, meant it was able to generate a hell of a lot of downforce. As a bonus, it had around 40% of its aerodynamic downforce over the front end, as opposed to Porsche's 25%, increasing front end grip and instilling that little bit of extra confidence for Jaguar's drivers to push it a bit further. The results speak for themselves. 1987 was a year of huge success for the XJR-8, which managed to win 8 out of 10 races in the WSC, only losing twice to Porsche 962s. While this bagged Jaguar an extraordinarily large winning margin over second-place Brunn Motorsport, it was not without disappointment. One of the races they had lost was Le Mans, and this was a race Jaguar could not leave unwon. 3 XJR-8s had contested Le Mans in 1987, 2 of them failed to finish, and the third was relegated to a 5th overall finish, after fighting gearbox trouble through much of the later stages of the race. 1988 would see a further evolution of Jaguar's design with the XJR-9. The car was very similar to the outgoing XJR-8, but that's not surprising given the success the XJR-8 had enjoyed in 1987. If it ain't broke and all that. Their focus was on Le Mans though this time. For the Jaguar team to stand a chance of winning at Le Mans, they would need to survive race distance unlike they had the previous year, and they'd also need to beat Porsche on the straights. To do this, Southgate and his team worked to reduce the drag of the car until it had a theoretical top speed of 240 miles per hour. The Porsches could achieve 235, which gave Jaguar just a 2% boost over the Porsches, but that's all they needed. The low drag variant was so drastically different to the normal XJR-9 that it was differentiated as a different car. It was the XJR-9 LM. The result was a huge success. The XJR-9, much like its predecessor, took the World Sports Car Championship by storm, winning 6 out of the 11 events. Crucially for Jaguar, this included victory at Le Mans. A huge moment for the team, who had ended Porsche's championship winning streak the year prior, and now Porsche's Le Mans winning streak as well. The silk-cut Jaguar team were crowned manufacturers' champions, and Jaguar driver Martin Brundle was given the Drivers' Championship too. While this Jaguar had been set up to beat the Porsches, in 1988 their biggest competition had actually been Sauber-Mercedes, who had actually beaten Jaguar at a number of events. It became clear Jaguar had a new enemy.
Whenever Group C sports car racing is talked about, the image is that of insanity. Distilled down and blown up in hundreds of cylinders across dozens of cars as they fought for some of the greatest accolades in motorsport. And while Group C may not always have been quite so ridiculous, our subject today certainly was. So fast in fact that the most famous motor racing track in the world was changed to ensure it could never happen again. This is the story of the Sauber-Mercedes C9. Group C was created in 1982 as a replacement for Group 5 and Group 6. Broadly, this was to consolidate the very pinnacle of sports car racing under a single set of regulations, and it was a hit. Sauber, having raced in Group 6 before the change, was involved in Group C from the very beginning, with its first proper Group C car, the Sauber C6. The C6 wasn't the success that Sauber surely hoped it would be, but was able to achieve some middling results, with an overall best finish of 4th place at Hockenheim in 1982. It was clear that there was room for improvement, and Sauber wasted no time in developing a new car, this time based around a 3.5-litre BMW inline-6 to replace the Cosworth motor that had been the heart of the C6. I'll let you have a guess at what the new car was called. Yeah, the C7 was unfortunately more of the same for Sauber. While they managed a respectable 9th place finish in the 1983 24 Hours of Le Mans, the BMW engine never seemed to be quite the right fit for the Swiss engineering firm. Sauber took a year out after selling the single C7 chassis to a private outfit halfway through the 1983 season, choosing to invest in the future and develop a car for 1985. At this time, Mercedes was looking for an in, but wasn't prepared to foot the huge bills associated with building a car from the ground up. Mercedes had an engine, and Sauber needed an engine, and so they entered into a marriage of convenience to form the Sauber-Mercedes C8. Despite the promise shown by Mercedes' 5-litre twin-turbocharged V8 and Sauber's undeniable chassis-building abilities, the 1985 season proved fruitless for Sauber-Mercedes. They qualified 17th at Le Mans, but failed to finish due to an accident, and then failed to even start any of the following events. For 1986, the team found more sponsorship money and became Coros Racing. While neither C8 was able to finish at Le Mans, the 1,000 kilometers of Nürburgring became Sauber's first victory of the Group C era, a race in which drivers Henry Pescarolo and Mike Thackwell crossed the line in first place. Undoubtedly, this first taste of victory served as both motivation and inspiration for the monster that would follow. First introduced in 1987, the Coros Sauber-Mercedes C9 was one of the most iconic cars to have ever graced Group C. While the exterior is markedly different to its predecessor, it shares a surprising amount with the old C8, including most of the chassis and drivetrain. That being said, the aluminium alloy monocoque was stiffened, and the 5-litre V8 was given new Triple K turbochargers, which boosted the car's power output to a monstrous 800 brake horsepower. 1987, however, was not the C9's year. The car wasn't able to perform as expected. The sky-high hopes after the C8's victory at the Nürburgring the previous year lay shattered, at least for team sponsor Coros, who chose not to renew their sponsorship of the team after the C9 only managed to score points in one of the 5 races it competed in 1987. 1988 saw big changes for what was now once again called the Sauber-Mercedes team. They found sponsorship in the form of AEG, an electronics company owned at the time by Daimler-Benz. To put it in simple terms, Mercedes now had the resources to fully commit to the C9 project. This showed, as 1988 marked a significant improvement over the previous year's effort, with the team managing 2nd place in the championship overall, losing only to the mighty Jaguar XJR-9. That being said, Le Mans had been less than plain sailing for the C9 in 1988, with the cars having to be retired due to concerns over the safety of their tyres following a blowout. 1989 was the year. There was clearly potential in the C9, the question was how to use it. It was decided that the C9's 800 horsepower wasn't enough, and so the engine was upgraded. The C9's 5-litre V8 now had aluminium heads and an increased boost tolerance for an estimated power output of 820 horsepower, a mammoth amount of power for a car that only weighed 905 kilograms. It shouldn't be surprising, therefore, that the car was fast. Really, really fast. The C9 won all but one race in 1989, including Le Mans, where one of the 3 C9s was able to set the second fastest speed ever recorded at the track during a qualifying session, a scary 248 miles per hour. The C9 was second only to the Peugeot P88 that had hit 251 miles per hour the previous year. This was deemed to be too fast, and officials feared for the future of safety at Le Mans if nothing was done to curb the speeds, which led to the creation of the 2 famous chicanes on the Mulsanne Straight, built after the 1989 season and first put to use in 1990. These roadblocks ensured that the Le Mans speed record would never be broken. Sauber had finally done it. After nearly a decade of trying and failing to crack the greatest endurance event in the world, they finally beat Le Mans.
Success is a dual-edged blade. The Sauber-Mercedes team now faced the prospect of having to follow up their biggest hit. The C9 wouldn't cut the mustard. They knew Jaguar were hot on their heels, so development of a brand new car was the only way forward. But this was no normal development process. See, there was a rule change coming in 1991. Group C1, the higher tier of the Group C formula, would be moving to much stricter engine regulations for the 1991 season. The extremely controversial changes would see the cars forced to adopt 3.5-litre F1 style engines. This left manufacturers in a tough spot, because the reality was that for 1990, before the rule changes, running a 3.5-litre engine would be prohibitively expensive and probably not actually very competitive. Mercedes' solution? Develop 2 cars. The 1990 Sauber-Mercedes C11. They skipped C10 apparently because it's hard to say in German. C10. I guess it's harder than C11. I guess, would be developed simultaneously, while a car for 1991, named the C291, would be developed too. On a side note, if C10 was too hard to say, why on earth did they decide to name the car that came after it the C291? Anyone's guess, really. Anyway, tangent aside, both these new cars would be built by Sauber, the biggest difference being the engine. The 730 horsepower, 5-litre twin-turbocharged V8 from the Sauber C9 would be carried over into the C11, who was capable of much more power unrestricted as well. Whereas the C291, built for the 3.5-litre rules, would have a brand new engine put into it, developed just for the car. Other than the engine, the C11 shared very little with the C9. Where the C9 had been built around a predominantly aluminium chassis, the new C11 was built around a much more technically advanced Kevlar and carbon fibre composite chassis. This had the result of making the C11 significantly lighter than the C9 and significantly more rigid. The C11 was so light, in fact, it had to take on board a significant amount of ballast to meet the 900 kg minimum class weight limit. It was surely a recipe for success. The car could generate around 20% more downforce than the outgoing Sauber C9 thanks to a ground-up aerodynamic redesign. And unlike its predecessor, the C11 wouldn't be contesting Le Mans in 1990 due to the fact it didn't count towards championship points that year. As such, the C11 was built without regard for having to install a low downforce kit used to help reach higher speeds on the Mulsanne Straight. The car was tested in late 1989 before its true debut at Suzuka in 1990, though that debut didn't exactly go to plan. The team got to Suzuka, the first race of the 1990 season, and driver Jean-Louis Schlesser crashed in practice, damaging the car so badly they had to revert to using C9s in the race. A race that they actually won anyway, even with the older car. Only up from there, right? Monza was the new C11's true debut. and this time nothing got in the way. The cars qualified first and second, with the leading car of Mauro Baldi qualifying 2 seconds faster than the closest non-Mercedes car. That is an enormous margin. The cars went on to score a 1-2 finish, cementing themselves as the frontrunners for the 1990 season and confirming Jaguar's worst fears. The following race was at Silverstone, and after the domination that the C11s had shown in Italy, the expectation was that it would be the same again. It would be a predictable race result. But things began to go wrong for Mercedes. For starters, they were going to have to contest the race a car down. The second car, driven by Jochen Mass and Michael Schumacher, yes, the Michael Schumacher, had been disqualified after a dodgy practice session. Unfortunately, the remaining car suffered the worst possible fate given the circumstances, an engine failure. Classic really, when they needed it most, it bricked itself. Silverstone was won by the still-cut Jaguar team, in the hands of another name you might recognise from Formula 1, Martin Brundle. But Jaguar's time at the top of the podium was short-lived. All of the remaining 6 races were won by the Sauber-Mercedes C11, handing the team a decisive Manufacturers' Championship victory, and Mercedes drivers Jean-Louis Schlesser and Mauro Baldi taking joint first place in the Drivers' Championship, with Jochen Mass in second, and Mercedes drivers Karl Wendlinger and Michael Schumacher coming home a joint 4th in the Drivers' Championship. Mercedes finished the season with more than double Jaguar's points. On a quick side note, Michael Schumacher was only 21 when driving for the Mercedes WSC program in 1990. He only competed in 3 races and managed to win the final race of the season in Mexico, where the leading Mercedes had been disqualified. While it was kind of unusual for open-wheel drivers to compete in endurance on their way up to Formula 1, the huge popularity of the World Sports Car Championship and Schumacher's excellent performance at the time helped boost his profile as a racing driver who would of course go on to become one of the greatest of all time. For 1991, the controversial 3.5-litre formula was pushed on to the World Sports Car Championship, more specifically its top class, C1. Older, non-conforming C1 cars that didn't meet the new engine requirements could contest a lower C2 class with heavy restrictions. Or in the case of the Mazda 787B, no restrictions at all, due to the fact it hadn't contested C1 previously and was the only car to have been classified as C2 both before and after the rule change. As for Mercedes though, their C291, built specifically for the new engine rules, which were basically the same as Formula 1's engine rules at the time, was eligible for the top C1 class. The small displacement of the engines and the fact they had to be naturally aspirated was a headache for the Mercedes team, who had become accustomed to the enormous and easy power of their 5-litre twin-turbocharged V8. In preparation for the rule change, Mercedes developed a brand new engine for the car, a 3.5-litre naturally aspirated flat 12. This was in contrast to Jaguar, who had sourced an existing engine from the Benetton F1 team, a Ford 3.5-litre V8, and Peugeot, who had built a V10. There was only one way to see who had made the right call. Mercedes was not the winner of that particular battle of ideas. The C291 was plagued with reliability issues right from the start. To extract any power out of the minuscule cylinders, the engine had to rev extraordinarily high. This high-strung power plant proved deeply unreliable and became an enormous headache for a manufacturer trying to defend a winning streak. They knew that the C291 would have problems, and so to try and collect some points, they would run the car at the start of the season alongside an old C11. This proved to be a good call, as the C291 failed to finish the first 2 races of the season, races in which the restricted C11 managed 2 podiums. At the 3rd race of the season at Silverstone, the C291 managed its first confidence-inspiring performance, finishing 2nd place behind Jaguar, but crucially, for the first time outperforming the car that it replaced. Despite this performance though, the team decided the C291 was guaranteed not to finish at Le Mans, and so they just simply didn't bother campaigning it at all. The Mercedes Le Mans effort was made up entirely of C11s that year, all of which were beaten roundly by the Mazda 787B. Mercedes had taken the interim period to try and work out all of the kinks with the C291, with the hopes of it being more competitive in the latter half of the season. They were confident enough that they removed the training wheels and ditched the C11 once and for all, betting the house on the C291. This was the wrong decision. Immediately, the C291 went on a streak of 3 DNFs, much to the despair of the team. They did manage to salvage one race win though, right at the very end of the season, with Michael Schumacher winning the final round at Autopolis, ending a terrible year for Mercedes on one high. 1991 was Jaguar's year, with the silk-cut Jaguar team claiming Constructors and Drivers' Championship victory thanks to the XJR-14. For 1991, the controversial 3.5 litre formula was pushed onto the top class in the WSC, C1. Older, non-conforming C1 cars would be able to contest the lower C2 class with heavy restrictions. For Jaguar though, this was a good excuse to swap out their troublesome Metro-based V6 for a 3.5 litre naturally aspirated V8 courtesy of Ford. It was the same engine used by the Benetton Formula 1 team. In fact, the 3.5 litre formula being used by C1 from 1991 was pretty much exactly the same engine rules as were in place in Formula 1. It's believed F1 wanted Group C manufacturers to be building Formula 1 style engines so that they could try and convince them to either field Formula 1 entries or become engine suppliers to other Formula 1 teams. More cynical people believed it was actually a ploy to kill off Group C because of its high viewing figures in comparison to Formula 1 at the time, making it serious competition. Either way, the results were dire for WSC, but it soldiered on for a few more years. While Jaguar could have contested C2 with one of their older cars, they chose to instead stay in the top flight C1 class where their primary competition would be Mercedes and Peugeot. Jaguar also brought in a new design team for what would become called the XJR-14. And in keeping with the F1 theme the WSC was attempting to foster, Jaguar hired Ross Brawn as the design lead, while TWR would continue in their capacity as constructor. The new rules, which had not only overhauled engine requirements but many other aspects of the sport as well, had ditched the fuel consumption limits that had defined Group C for years. This resulted in many of the new generation C1 cars being extremely light and having huge amounts of aerodynamic downforce in comparison to their predecessors. Race 1 of the 1991 season at Suzuka, and Peugeot managed to win with their 905, a shock result as it was expected that Jaguar would have the fastest car. Race 2 at Monza, and Jaguar found their feet, taking victory with their new XJR-14 and its race-proven V8, something that could not be so easily said for Peugeot's V10 and Mercedes' ridiculous flat 12. Race 3 at Silverstone, and again the XJR-14 took victory, showing unparalleled manoeuvrability that its competitors simply could not match. Race 4 was Le Mans, and in 1991 this was a bit of an odd one. Mercedes had been having serious reliability issues with their C291, and ultimately they chose not to race the car at Le Mans, believing that there was absolutely no chance at all that it would survive. They chose instead to field one of their older C11s in the C2 class and take the penalties. Jaguar had planned to use their new XJR-14 but came to the same conclusion, choosing as well to run an older XJR-12 with heavy restrictions in the C2 class. Peugeot chose to compete in C1 with the 905, and the car proved deeply unreliable over the grueling 24 hours. Proving that Mercedes and Jaguar had probably been right. Le Mans was won by the Mazda 787B, which found itself in a unique position as the only C2 car that had been categorised as C2 both before and after the engine rule change. This meant that it competed in the C2 class without the restrictions placed on the other C2 cars that had previously been competing in C1 prior to the changes.
Mazda had been using Wankel rotary engines in prototypes for a long time before the 787B. In fact, Mazda had competed in the Group C Junior class with the two-rotor 717C in 1983, only the second year of Group C's running. However, there's a reason that these earlier cars aren't well remembered. They never did very well. The first 3 generations used a two-rotor, similar in concept to the engine used in the RX-7 of the time, with the 757 seeing the introduction of a 3-rotor engine and the 767 running a 4-rotor engine.
Now, if all this rotor talk is sounding a bit alien, let me give you some history.
The famous Mazda Wankel engines are rotary internal combustion engines characterized by small displacement and big power. Contrary to what many believe, this was not an engine type developed by Mazda, rather a German engineer who had an unfortunately funny name. Regardless, Mazda have owned the design since the early 1960s, and tried for many years to brutally beat it into the limelight through the notoriously cost-effective medium of motorsport.
Mazda had stood by the Wankel engine for 45 years, and despite being the only company to have any real commercial success with the product, their success was by no means novel. There is no better example of this than the Mazda 787 and 787B.
The 2.6-litre 4-rotor engine in the 787 and its B variant produced up to 700 brake horsepower, a remarkable figure given its small displacement. Mazda themselves say the engine could in fact produce up to 900 brake horsepower, at an astounding 10,500 RPM. However, the engine was never run in this configuration due to the fact it would,
blow up or something,
and was instead limited to just 9,000 RPM. The Mazda 787B was of course an impressive car, but really no more impressive than the utterly ridiculous cars that it would find itself huddled with on the grid. Mazda had been racing with rotary for many years by this point, but had seen very little success, and with the threat of regulatory changes to outlaw the rotary engine, Mazda was feeling the pressure to finally realise the technology's racing potential. It was all or nothing now. Its monocoque chassis was made of a combination of Kevlar and carbon fibre composites, and the body panels too were made of carbon fibre composite. This meant the car was very rigid, but more importantly, very, very light. In combination with the very small displacement rotary engine, the entire car weighed just 830 kilograms, giving it a power-to-weight ratio of over 840 brake horsepower per tonne. This meant the car could easily accelerate from 0 to 62 miles an hour in less than 3.5 seconds, and up to a top speed of just over 210 miles per hour.
We're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here, so let's rewind to back before the 787 got its B.
The 1990 787 was entered into a large number of races, often racing alongside the older 767B. Its all-time highest placement was 5th, after which it was disqualified anyway for having an oversized fuel cell, meaning its highest legal finish in 1990 was a middling 10th place. Not much to write home about, and probably not too likely to get customers excited about rotary. Encountering a number of mechanical and electrical failures, and having not come close to winning any event it entered, it became clear to Mazda that the 1991 racing season desperately needed to be different. In 1991, the 787B was rolled out just after the start of the season. The B denotes an array of minor tweaks and upgrades over the older 787, which allowed it to perform noticeably better during testing, saving multiple seconds on test laps in Japan. It achieved a couple of 6th place finishes, but nothing outstandingly impressive. The team quickly moved focus to the biggest race of the season, the 24 Hours of Le Mans. As it became apparent, this might be their one shot at the glory they'd been missing out on for years. Mazda ran 3 cars at Le Mans in 1991, a 787 from the previous year, and 2 of the brand new 787B cars. One of these cars, number 55, was adorned with the famous Renown livery, in honour of the Japanese clothing brand that had sponsored the Mazda racing team since 1988 and provided all of their clothing.
It was decided the day before the race that Mazda's usual conservative strategy of mechanical and fuel preservation was to be dropped. The recent performance of the 787B had instilled confidence in team manager Ohashi to instruct the drivers to drive the entire race as if it was a sprint. He was taking a big gamble on the car's reliability and continued fuel efficiency.
His gamble paid off in a major way. The number 55 car crossed the finish line in first place, having completed 362 laps, equivalent to nearly 5,000 kilometers, a new record for the recently reconfigured circuit. After Le Mans, the winning car was retired, and the others carried the mantle forward for Mazda, and rotary had been vindicated. For the 1992 racing season, the rotary engine was outlawed, bringing an end to Mazda's family of rotary Group C cars, making the 787B the last one, and cementing its place in the history books.
It's a compelling story to assert that the 787B and the technology that powered it were just too fast, and the FIA had to ban it to stop it from dominating again. But I hate to break it to you, that ain't true. Truly would be a story for the ages, sure. A small manufacturer storming the scene and beating all the big guys with the power of rotary. But the truth is, the 787B was not an especially gifted race car, a story best told by its distinct lack of podium finishes in any other race. The real reason it won was perhaps more circumstance than engineering wizardry. The number 55 car had made its way to third place, behind the two Mercedes cars.
The second place car went off the track and retired, having suffered severe damage to its gearbox. This put Mazda in second. A second place finish at Le Mans is frankly already more than they ever could have expected, but their luck was not about to change. The first place Mercedes was forced to retire with mechanical faults, placing Mazda in first place, with a Jaguar trailing it in second place by 2 laps. But the Jag was suffering from trouble of its own, and in the end, the Mazda survived long enough to claim victory. At Le Mans, reliability can be more powerful than speed. The 787B taught us that. We should remember this great machine for what it did achieve. Pretending that it was the fastest car ever or that rotary was somehow too good to be allowed isn't just false, but does a disservice to the real legacy of one of the sport's most interesting champions.
As for the ban on rotary, well, the claim that that was in response to Mazda's 1991 win simply isn't true. In fact, the 1991 car was only allowed to race after Mazda lobbied to have the rule change postponed to give it time to develop a new engine. In other words, the fate of rotary at Le Mans had been sealed years before.
Ohashi's gamble paid off for Mazda, but they hardly had all that much to lose if it hadn't. I can't speak to the feelings within Mazda at the time, but I have to imagine that the decision to just go ham in 1991 was less a calculated decision and more sheer desperation to try and find a result to justify their years of dedication to a technology that unfortunately just didn't love them back anywhere near as much.
Race 5 was at the Nürburgring, and Jaguar were back on form, taking victory in Germany. Peugeot had a trick up their sleeve though. The 905B would be brought in to replace their 905 for the remainder of the season, and the following 2 races were won by their new car, upsetting what was looking like it was going to be a cruise to the finish for the silk-cut Jaguar team. The final race of the season saw a shock victory for Sauber-Mercedes, who managed to win at Autopolis. But the season was already over. Jaguar had done it. They had secured another manufacturer's championship, with Jaguar driver Theo Fabi taking Drivers' Championship victory as well. After 1991, Jaguar saw the writing on the wall for Group C in the WSC and chose not to compete any further, ending their time in the sport on a high note.
Group C Sportscar Racing birthed some of the greatest racing machines ever made. Icons of the automotive world like the dominant Porsche 956 and 962, the monstrous Sauber-Mercedes C9, and many, many more. But for over a decade after the introduction of the fastest class in sports car racing, no French manufacturer was able to win their home event, the greatest endurance event in the world, the 24 Hours of Le Mans. Peugeot set out to change this, with a brand new Group C project dubbed 905. Peugeot engineers weren't completely out of the loop when it came to Group C racing. In 1988, a Peugeot-powered car named the WM-P88 Peugeot set the Le Mans speed record at 252 miles per hour, a record that still stands to this day thanks to the introduction of chicanes to the Mulsanne Straight in 1990. The WM-P88 wasn't a full factory effort though. Peugeot provided the power plant, but WM built and ran the car. Perhaps it got Peugeot thinking about an attempt under their own name though, maybe even one that didn't blow up in the early stages. In November of 1988, a team was put together to design and build a Le Mans Group C car to compete in the 1991 season for Peugeot. Led by legendary Jean Todt, the head of Peugeot Talbot Sport at the time, work began to put a French manufacturer back on top at Le Mans. The 905 project marked a departure from Peugeot's established racing efforts, which through the 80s had focused primarily on rally. However, with the demise of Group B, the manufacturer pivoted to racing the rapid 205 T16 in rally raid and hill climb events instead, but these were far more niche than the hugely popular Group B had been, prompting the marque to explore new motorsport avenues, ultimately leading them to Le Mans. Peugeot had taken the decision to wait until 1991 to take advantage of a planned rule change that year. The first iteration of the 905 was unveiled in 1990, and in an effort to test the car, it was entered into the final 2 races of the 1990 season. They knew the car wouldn't be super competitive in a field of contemporary Group C cars. They were instead racing the other cars already running in the 3.5 litre class, important for the following year. In this competition, Peugeot did well, proving the 905 had a shot in 1991. The 905 was built around a carbon fibre chassis manufactured by Dassault and was powered by a 3.5 litre naturally aspirated V10, capable of producing around 650 horsepower and very similar to the engines common to F1 at the time. The stage was set for the 1991 season. The beginning of the end for the Group C class was at hand, everyone knew it, and they were ready to race. Peugeot didn't get off to a particularly great start. Their car had some reliability issues. Don't make a French joke. Don't make a French joke. But more importantly, it was slower than Jaguar's lightning-quick XJR-14. The 905 managed a fluke win in Suzuka, but after both cars retired before the 4-hour mark at Le Mans, the team knew something had to change. They wasted no time at all in completely re-engineering the car, binning the majority of the old body, keeping only the cockpit and totally redesigning the car with the hopes of better aero. The reworked 905, named the 905B, featured a truly massive 2-tier rear wing, as well as an optional front wing for even more downforce. This wasn't enough though. What's the point in downforce without power? They swapped in a new engine, another 3.5 litre V10, now capable of producing around 715 brake horsepower. While I'm sure they knew what they were doing from an aerodynamic perspective, the styling may have been collateral damage. I won't go as far to say the car is ugly, though I couldn't disagree, just that it's too weird for me to have a particularly strong opinion at all. I actually think it's really cool, but it's definitely not beautiful. Comment below to let me know what you think of it. The new car debuted at the Nürburgring towards the end of the 1991 season, where it once again lost to the Jaguar, but the team was still confident it was going to work. They were right. The following 2 races at Magny-Cours and Mexico City were won by the 905B, a remarkable turnaround for a team that had started the season so poorly. But of course, for that season at least, it was too little too late for Peugeot, with the championship going the way of the silk-cut Jaguar team and their amazing XJR-14. Peugeot had a taste of victory now though. They knew there was a chance for more, and so for 1992, the 905B was back. Unfortunately, in protest to the extreme costs of competing under the new rules associated with homologating a car for Group C1, there was a mass exodus of manufacturers from the World Sports Car Championship in 1992. So bad in fact that only 3 manufacturers competed as factory teams that year: Toyota running the TS010, Mazda with the MXR1, and Peugeot. Peugeot won the team's championship, and Peugeot drivers Yannick Dalmas and Derek Warwick took a joint victory of the Drivers' Championship. Le Mans was a bit different though. The ACO, the governing body for the 24 Hours of Le Mans, didn't play by the same rules, much to the chagrin of Bernie Ecclestone, and so many manufacturers chose to still compete in the event. Despite this, Peugeot's 905B still proved fastest on Sunday, finishing 1st and 3rd overall with 1 car retiring. The winning car was driven by Derek Warwick, Yannick Dalmas and Marc Blundell. After the complete debacle that had been the 1992 WSC, the competition was canned, and no such competition was to take place in 1993. This proved to be a massive blow for Peugeot, who had secretly been working on a new car for the 1993 season and beyond. The 905 Evo 2 Supercopter, as it was known, looked like something out of sci-fi, way ahead of its time, but alas, it wasn't to be. Peugeot instead took its engine to F1, but perhaps that's a story for another day. Peugeot still chose to compete at the not cancelled 1993 24 Hours of Le Mans with the 905B. They won again, cementing the car's legacy as a great racing car, but also a controversial one. The regulations Peugeot thrived under ultimately killed Group C Sportscar Racing, which after 1994 wasn't seen again in major competition, at least not leading the way. The fall of Group C gave rise to the far more sensible GT1 class, but of course, this being motorsport, it didn't stay sensible for very long. You can check out one of my favourite GT1 stories here. Thanks for watching, and until next time, goodbye.